Charles Kupchan, thank you for being with us. Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. You have served on the staff of the National Security Council with Bill Clinton and then the Barack Obama administration. And from 2014 to 2017, you have been special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs. Over the past year, Charles has been following closely the development in the Ukraine and the West's response to the invasion. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here with us and to have your keynote address now, and then you will be participating in a panel with other esteemed colleagues. Charles, last February, you tweeted that the US and the West should prepare for a diplomatic endgame in Ukraine. Is a just peace for all the actors involved achievable? And in that case, what should it look like?
Thank you, Paolo. It's a pleasure to be here and to join the Future Leaders Conference. You know, if you and I had had this conversation last May instead of this May, I think none of us would have predicted that the war would have gone as well as it has from the perspective of Ukraine and from the perspective of the West. And Ukraine has put up a remarkable defense against Russian aggression, and the United States and Europe have stayed in lockstep in ways that I would not have predicted, and our publics have continued to support more aid, economic and military, to Ukraine. And just over the last weekend at the G7, a decision was made to start training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. So far, so good. You may then ask, well, then why talk about an endgame? And let me share with you how I see the conflict going forward. I think we should do whatever we can now to help Ukraine make a success of its coming offensive, to take back as much land as possible in the coming months. That having been said, I don't believe that Ukraine, over the course of this year, will succeed in taking back every inch of its territory, which is what we hope for, which is what Zelensky says he aims to do. But I do think we have to be realistic, and we have to make a plan B for the contingency that at the end of this offensive, some chunk of Ukrainian territory, probably Crimea, maybe some of Donbass, will not be under Ukrainian control. And as a consequence, I think we need to have a quiet conversation within NATO, with Ukraine, about what happens when we get to that point. And I don't think the answer is, well, more of the same. And I think that we need to have a realistic look at the costs of this war and weigh those costs against the argument that we need to stay the course for as long as it takes. And there are four issues that motivate my thinking about why we need to think about an endgame. One, this is a war that's destroying Ukraine. And I think you could argue that it's better to have a Ukraine in possession of, let's say, 89% of its territory. They now have about 85, 86. Maybe they'll get 93, maybe they'll get 94. But a Ukraine that is rebuilding for the future, rather than a Ukraine that could potentially turn into a failed state because it fights for the next several years. Two, this is a war that could escalate. We've seen missiles fall on Polish territory, NATO. We've seen Russian aircraft force down a US drone. We saw a few weeks ago a couple of drones explode over the Kremlin. This is a war that has the potential to turn into World War III. As a consequence, we need to bring it to an end sooner rather than later. Three, this is a war that is polarizing the international system. The US, its allies in Asia and Europe on one side, Russia and China on the other side, two blocks, most of the rest of the world not taking sides. India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Even major democracies are saying, we don't want to get caught in a new era of East-West rivalry. This is a dangerous moment because, as some of the speakers already said, we need multilateralism. We need great power cooperation to tackle climate change, to tackle the management of AI. Finally, I do worry about us. To put it in different terms, the threat posed by illiberal populism in the West is, in my mind, at least as potent a threat as that posed by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
But on this point, you said, I'm worried by us. I thought you were going to say by the US. But let me ask you specifically on the US, because in the us, we have the US election next year. And there are rising concern that a Republican, whoever, at the White House would make a difference. How do you assess that scenario? On the war, I mean.
Well, I do think that us has to be defined as the collective West, both sides of the Atlantic, because I don't think that either of us is out of the woods. That is to say that our political centers have weakened. In Italy, in France, in the US, there are individuals with illiberal tendencies. I have to say, in my own country, I find it somewhat unrecognizable what's happened to our politics. Now, I don't think it will take the new election to potentially change American policy in Ukraine. Look at public opinion going somewhat soft. Look at the fact that the House of Representatives is now controlled by Republicans, and the Republican Party is deeply split between hawks and an America First wing. It's not at all clear to me that when Biden goes and says, I need another $30 billion to support Ukraine, Congress is going to say, here's the check. Now, as a consequence, I do think that Biden is better off heading into this election with the war either over or on the way down, because if it's full force, more money, more weapons, I think Trump and his wing of the party are going to use it for electoral purposes. I'm still confident that Biden will be reelected, but I do think that we have to keep a very close eye on getting our political systems back up on their feet and making sure that liberal democracy is solid going forward. We don't want to see Ukraine win and wake up the next morning and see our own liberal democracies eroding from inside.
Thank you, Charles. You have kindly agreed to stay for the panel, and so let me invite the panelists for the session on Ukraine to reach us on the floor, and we will immediately start the session. Let's welcome our panelists with a round of applause. Thomas, you can sit here. Thomas Gomart, Director of IFRI, Andrei Kolesnikov, Senior Fellow and Chair at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, welcome. Alyona Jetmachuk, Founder and Director of the New Europe Center in Kiev, and last but not the least, Luanda Mgoze, Future Think Tank Leader for the South African Institute of International Affairs. You are all welcome to our meeting. Some of you are old friends, some are new faces in this meeting, but you are both very welcome. Thomas, in a recent paper, you highlight the return of geopolitical blocs. As the Ukraine war is increasingly presented by Russia and the West as an existential threat, are we moving even faster towards competing blocs?
First of all, Paolo, thank you for your invitation and thank you for organizing this great meeting. I don't remember having written something so stupid.
I proofs.
So you have to refer. Now, the thing is, I think I was trying to explain the evolution of the geopolitics of energy when I say about new blocks. I will start with that because I do think that one of the main consequences of the war in Ukraine is the energy rupture between Europe and Russia, which was something very well established in the beginning of the 80s. And I observed that since more than 1 year, there is a tendency which is in fact that energy security has become a top priority everywhere in the world. And that we observe a sort of convergence, energy convergence, between Russia, China, Iran. And is it a bloc? Is it an energy bloc? It's an open question. And I observe also, a shift coming from Saudi Arabia in this regard. Saudi Arabia is more and more independent in its energy policy and does want to solidify the OPEC plus agreements between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And on the other side, if you observe, the compensation of the Russian and oil gas, there are part of that which is coming from Gulf countries, but it's quite limited. Part of that which is coming from Algeria, which is also limited, but namely it's coming from Norway, the UK, and the US. So that's why, I had this perspective of sort of energy blocks. So now, to go to your more political question, I think that we face a situation in which, in fact, there is much more transatlantic unity to support Ukraine against the Russian aggression. And there is also this feeling that Russia is supported by China. And there is also another group, a large group of countries, which do blame Russia, but which decided not to sanction Russia. And some of them are coming from what you call the global south, which is for me the transactional south, but also countries like India. So that's why, in fact, this war is very important because it's creating such sort of groupings, but I won't use, the wording of blocks.
Would you agree, Thomas, with the point which Charles just made on the need to work on an end game while supporting Ukraine, and he mentioned 4 reasons to do that?
Sorry?
Would you agree on the point Charles just made on the need to have an end game, to actively work on an end game on Ukraine war?
Of course. The question is, the decision taken by the Ukrainian leadership. Once again, that's the starter. Ukraine is fighting. It's an existential fight, and I think that Aliona will be back on that directly. So it is for sure the Ukrainian decision, and I belong to those who think that Ukraine should be supported until its decision.
Yeah, I would immediately turn to you, Aliona, because on the point Thomas just raised, we all know that Ukraine should not give to Russian, should not accept Russian blackmail. We know that a just and fair end game is needed, but we all know that this is not necessarily feasible. Where do you think the line should be drawn in exchange for peace? I mean, this is something we keep asking to everyone coming from Ukraine. Your president was in Italy a week ago, and he had 3 or 7 altogether, director of newspaper and TV program, asking the same question, which is the one I'm posing to you right now.
Thank you, Paolo. It's good to be back to Milan, even for 1 day. First of all, I would like, we hope that regaining all territories is still feasible. As we love saying in Ukraine, the goal defines mean. So if the goal is to achieve lasting peace, not just another fragile ceasefire, there will definitely be means for that. But, if the goal is to have another ceasefire just and frozen conflict and Minsk III deal. Of course, this task would be more complicated for us. But anyway, I believe that it's still doable. And as you know, and as Italians people know, no one and no country in the world is more interested in peace than Ukraine is. So because it's our people are dying, it's our children are kidnapped and forcefully deported to Russia, the Russian Federation, and we are under missile strikes and drone strikes almost on daily basis, and I came to Kiev, so I know what I'm talking about. But the point is that we are interested in this lasting, just peace, not another ceasefire. And the ceasefire, as we experienced since 2015, and it basically led to this large-scale invasion, let's be honest. So, and if someone would try to sell Ukraine another ceasefire, another Minsk deal as the end of the war, or even as Ukraine's victory, it would not work. Because Ukraine is a democracy, and Thomas mentioned that Ukrainian leadership would decide. I would say that even that Ukrainian society and Ukraine society would decide on behalf of Ukraine, because we are a democracy, and in Ukrainian society now we have 72% of people who are against any concessions. So I think that basically Ukrainian society reached a point of no return in terms of any concessions. And the more aggressive Putin is, the more evidence of executed civilians, of mass graves, of of all war crimes committed by Russia, the less space for any concessions and for any compromises remains, unfortunately. There was a chance, and Ukraine was very serious about negotiating peace last year. There was a diplomatic offer in March last year. There was President Zelensky 10 points peace plan released at the G20 summit, and his call to conduct a global peace summit. But unfortunately, we don't see any indications that Russian leadership is serious about any negotiations. We don't see any indication. Yes, there are some calls sometimes, and usually when they start losing on battlefields, they start calling for negotiations or talking about talks. But in fact, by those calls, they're pursuing two goals now. The first goal is, from our perspective, the first goal is to destroy Ukraine's counteroffensive, and the second goal is to discredit Ukraine globally as a country which doesn't want to negotiate. But we want to negotiate. We want negotiated peace, but we are striving for sustainable peace, lasting peace.
Alyona, can I ask Charles to make a comment on your comments? Charles, please.
I support the same end if it's possible to achieve it. I would like to see Ukraine in possession of every inch of its territory. I think we have to prepare for the possibility that that may not be where this conflict ends up anytime soon, and then we have to ask, then what? I also think it's important not to presume that if Ukraine expels Russia, then Russia will behave. And if Ukraine is left in possession of 6% of Ukrainian territory, then they're just going to do this again. They will do this again as long as Putin or somebody like Putin is around. And as a consequence, we need to have a long-term plan to prepare Ukraine to defend itself for the future, because it lives in a dangerous neighborhood, however this war ends.
and supplying F-16 moves in that direction, supporting Ukraine for a long-term resistance, more than just winning right now. Thank you, Charles. Andrei, let's move a little bit to Russia, because can you confirm that in February you wrote an article whose title was, whose title was "Russians Learn to Stop Worrying and Love the War"? Can you confirm that?
Yes.
Yes. If so, apparently from your article, it's not only Putin's war. What is today's approach of Russia to the war? Has it changed?
Yes, you know, it was a title of my editor in Foreign Affairs, so, because it's just too provocative, but the part of the truth is in it. I recently read an article with the old Italian anecdote, in a sense joke, not historical anecdote, about Mussolini, when during the breakfast one of the sons of Mussolini asked him, "Father, what does it mean, fascism?" And Mussolini, being furious, says, "Eat up and shut up." And this formula, this is quite exact description of the authoritarian way of the behavior of the society. But the problem is that we crossed this line of the authoritarian regime. The problem is that since maybe September 2022, when there was a partial mobilization in Russia, Putin violated old social contract with the society. Do not intervene in our affairs, in our corruption, in everything. We will not intervene into your private life, which is kind of more or less normal in terms of market economy. But from September, from October, he asked the population to share their voices, their corpse, their bodies. You have to share the responsibility, guys, he said to the society, and go to the war, go to the trenches. This is absolutely another situation. The level of anxiety was very high at that very time. There were some protests, but the society, generally speaking, the majority of the society survived this threat. And now war is routinized, but again, there are two myths about Russian society. Nobody supports in reality war because people simply, they hide their views. Another point of view is all Russians, they all support this war. This is also not true. Generally speaking, we have, if we'll even take the famous figure 70% of support according to the data of independent Levada Center, this is simply a general figure because inside this figure there are a lot of different contradictory feelings. I mean, around 15 maybe percent, according to my colleague sociologists, these people are active conformists, active supporters of the war, very cruel in their behavior, in their vision, etc., etc. Other part of this support, this is kind of men in the middle who will support everything which is coming from the top because these people, they don't have their own opinion, just like nearly in any society. And on the other flank, we see active non-conformists, or like passive non-conformists, which were always 15-20%, which were always against Putin, against his initiatives. They were pro-liberal, pro-Western, pro-democratic. And here is the divisions in this society.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Luanda, someone mentioned, Charles, I think, mentioned that when we look at Africa and other parts of the world, condemning Russia and supporting Ukraine is not shared by everybody. There are different views. Has that to do with effective Russia propaganda, or do you see any other explanation for this different view?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me as a new face. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's important that we're able to speak about this as Africans in platforms that have dynamic groups of people and people from different regions, so that we're not speaking amongst ourselves. I think certainly this one requires a lot of nuance. You know, the first resolution, ES-11/1, to condemn Russia at the UN really was the beginning of a very interesting time in foreign affairs and how Africa is viewed in relation to the war. 22 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 1 country voted against it, with 17 countries abstaining and several other countries not being in the room during the vote. In favor were countries such as Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, Egypt. Against was Eritrea. And countries that abstained are South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Angola, Mozambique. So it shows you that there's really a perceived division in how Africa voted. It demonstrates at least a perception that the region is not voting in coalesce. However, we really do need to look at the statements and the positions to really get to understand quite significantly where Africa stands in the matter. There's an important convergence from the African region in calling for peace and a peaceful solution. Although all these countries voted differently, South Africa and Kenya stand together in their call for a peaceful solution and a diplomatic solution in the war. Rwanda said solution can only be achieved through dialogue by the parties. Namibia promotes peace, respect for international law, settling disputes through peaceful means. When reading the statements from countries in the West, there is no advancement of peace and peaceful solutions, and that is what we desperately need at this point to end the war. So attributing Africa's response to Russian propaganda, I'm afraid, kind of strips away Africa's agency, because you cannot deny that this war is happening against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions and a very, very tense global landscape. So this is where Africa becomes the theater of geopolitical contestation, and countries have to look after their interest first before responding in any particular manner and not trying to go back to the Cold War era. So I think there's a lot of agency there, and there's a lot of nuance there that we really, really need to study before we analyze Africa's response.
Thank you, Luanda. Thank you. We have a second round of questions, shorter than the previous one, because we have to move then to the next session. Let me start again from Thomas. We, the European Union, have provided relevant military and economic support to Ukraine, much more than we thought, much less than the US. And President Macron keeps insisting on the European strategic autonomy, but is Europe getting out of the war more or less autonomous from the US, from your standpoint?
You know, to comment on President Macron's statement is a big challenge for me.
Yeah,
as you know, he was said to be the chief tanker, the think tanker in chief, by Politico. So I don't want to comment on that. But your question is very important. A way to rephrase it is to ask what would have been the U.S. position with Donald Trump in the White House, and that's this question for after 2024. So for sure, I think that if the US won't have supported so significantly Ukraine, I'm afraid of saying that Europeans certainly would have, sent tanks, and that would have been all. So the question now of strategic autonomy, there is a huge step which was made by Europeans in security and defense matter, in their mindset, I would say, with this war at the core of Europe. Because Europe lost its main competitive advantage at the global level, which was its strategic stability. It's over, and I think it's over, unfortunately, for 1, 2, maybe 3 decades. So the question for Europeans is, of course, there is now this transatlantic unity, which is highly important to support Ukraine, as I said initially. But what will be the European attitude if Donald Trump, or another one, this type of profile, would be elected? And it's a question not only regarding Ukraine and Russia, it's a question for Europeans, how Europe is able to stabilize its neighborhood by itself in the links with NATO if needed, but also with maybe another US behavior in the coming decade. And that's something very difficult to be anticipated. And that's why I think that Europeans should be prepared to act within NATO and within the EU, but maybe with a less important US involvement.
Thank you, Thomas. Andrei, many Russians decided to flee abroad. You choose to stay in Moscow despite opposing the war in public. Can we take that as a positive signal, meaning that you believe that civil society can promote change in Russia?
You know, my staying in Moscow, this is not positive signal, rather negative. This is simply a personal decision which could be changed in a case of emergency, not to mention that I am a foreign agent, officially foreign agent in Russia. This is a special legal status, and the history of Russia could be measured by different personal family stories. For instance, my mother was the daughter of enemy of people, and she's in that sense mother of a foreign agent, nearly the same. But you know, civil society still exists. Yes, we can see these people in the streets, but we must understand that we live in the circumstances where police and military suppression inside Russia is higher than in Soviet times, at least at Brezhnev era, not to mention Gorbachev era. Civil society is ready to suggest kind of changes. Diaspora is ready. Diaspora is extremely important because the majority of media relocated to the West, and they are very important to the audience inside Russia, which needs information, alternative opinions, and compassion. So, but we can distinguish these elements of the civil society using simply criminal statistics. You know, nearly 20,000 detentions for anti-war position, more than 500 criminal cases against people with anti-war position, 6,500 cases on the administrative basis for the discreditation, so-called discreditation of the army, extrajudicial prosecution, nearly 800 media resources blocked or closed in Russia, fired professors, fired teachers, purges in universities, purges among lawyers who are defending dissidents. This is civil society. Yes, they crushed the organizational basis of the civil society, not to mention opposition. But it resists, it is ready to suggest some plans for the future. It is ready to think about collective responsibility and guilt at the end of the day. But you know, in this situation, for sure, the society needs some help from the very top. Elites are for Putin. They simply serve him, even in a case if they express somewhere in secret places discontent with Putin as well. But unfortunately, during the Putin's period, we will not have any kind of serious changes, and they must come from the top, just like it was always in the history of Russia after death of Stalin and death of Kremlin's gerontocrats.
Thank you, Andrei. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I do want to conclude with Aliona and you. Aliona, Charles mentioned that he is worried by us, meaning the fatigue in Western society. Aren't you worried as well a little bit that our strong support may at a point diminish? And some, I mean, you have an incredible president who is an incredible ambassador of your struggle, of your drama, but never in recent history a crisis has been dominating for months or years, if that could continue. Are you contemplating that fatigue?
Thank you for this question. Yes, of course, we are worried, but still we see quite strong support, quite a high level of solidarity, especially in Europe, in the US, and our think tank just commissioned an opinion poll in 5 countries, the US, Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, which showed that on some issues, public is even more decisive and more supportive than decision makers and governments of those countries. I'm not talking about Italy. In Italy, we have different picture, but on some other countries, for example, on issues like NATO, Ukraine's NATO membership, public is much more supportive, and majority of people who express their opinion already support formal invitation to Ukraine to NATO already in Vilnius NATO summit. What can Ukraine do here? Of course, we can conduct successful counteroffensive and demonstrate in this way that all of the investments are paid back. We can continue reforms because we want to win not only the war, but we want to win the peace, as our American partners are saying. That's why we are conducting reforms, and we are successfully implementing 7 recommendations European Union provided to us together with candidate status. And this year we are expecting for political decision of opening accession talks. But we also can't, we have to also debunk Russian propaganda narratives worldwide. And here we ask for your support, think tank and opinion leaders support, because we cannot do it like without your help and without your support here. And then you all will be invited to big Sevastopol victory party, of course.
And we will surely come. Luanda, you have the last comment. We have been repeating many times in the last months that the loser of this new tension is multilateralism and global institutions. And the winner are like-minded grouping, like the G7. Someone says also BRICS, but do you think BRICS is really a like-minded group?
I absolutely do think it's a like-minded group. It's a convergence of countries with different ideologies, regimes, and they function differently, and the economies are not the same. But what is very common is the strong support for multilateralism. It's the recognition that the global architecture we live in has winners and losers, where big powers sometimes get to do as they please, even though we do live in a rules-based international order. So BRICS, you'll see them, strongly cooperating in areas where they want to strengthen multilateralism, where they want to strengthen local currencies, where there is a support for the rules in which we live under to a larger extent. And we have seen an interest from other countries wanting to join the BRICS since the 2013 outreach initiative by South Africa, and then subsequently by the Chinese BRICS Plus initiative. And there has been a very strong push from the Chinese for a formal expansion, which has not been received well by the other members. But with the current geopolitical landscape as it is, I do think it's receiving considerable attention, and we can anticipate probably an expansion. So that's the importance of groupings and blocks.
Thank you. I was moving close because I have my colleague saying, end, we have to finish. And so I was moving towards you to give the impression that the end is coming. The end of the session. Please join me with a great round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We were worried we had lost Alexandra Romantsova. We couldn't find her, but she's here. Welcome.